the basis. For example, notice this ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1892. The court said, "No purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation." What would lead the court to conclude that we are a Christian nation? This case was not long, only 16 pages in the court records, but the court provided 87 different historical precedents to support its conclusions. The court quoted the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Founding Fathers, the acts of the Congresses, the acts of the state governments, and so on. At the end of 87 precedents, the court explained that it could continue to cite many additional precedents, but that certainly 87 were sufficient to conclude that we were a Christian nation. Keep in mind that the court provided 87 precedents in this case. This is important because the courts based their decision on precedents. To the court, it is important to go back and examine both history and rulings from previous cases so that the court can continue to be consistent in its present rulings. We'll return to the importance of precedents a little later. In 1844, a school in Philadelphia announced that it would teach its students morality, but not religion. It believed that it didn't need Christianity in the Bible, that it could teach morality without them. Sounds just like schools today. This policy, among others, caused this case to come before the U.S. Supreme Court. Some of the justices on the court at this time had been appointed by James Madison. Notice what the Supreme Court told that school. "Why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, be read and taught as a divine revelation in the schools, its general precepts expounded and its glorious principles of morality inculcated? Where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly or so perfectly as from the New Testament?" The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that schools would teach Christianity and the Bible, the source of morality. Today we hear just the opposite. Few realize that today's rulings by the court often repudiate rulings delivered by the Founding Fathers themselves. In 1811, a court made a ruling which was subsequently cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. That court declared, "Whatever strikes at the root of Christianity tends manifestly to the dissolution of civil government." Although this case dealt with a man who went into a profanity fit, profanity wasn't the problem. It was the intent of his profanity. For it had not been a moment of anger or a temporary loss of control, but it was a deliberate and a planned act. He had even taken the time to write it out and distribute it. In that writing, he had maliciously and capriciously attacked Jesus Christ, declaring that Jesus Christ is so-and-so, or God is so-and-so, or the Bible is such and such, continuing through a string of accusations and profanities against Jesus Christ and the Word of God. The court explained that the problem with his writings was that an attack on Jesus Christ was an attack on Christianity. An attack on Christianity was an attack on the foundation of the country. Therefore, an attack on Jesus Christ was equivalent to an attack on the country. This man was sentenced to 3 months in prison and a $500 fine for attacking the country by attacking Jesus. And notice the date of that case, 1811, nearly 2 decades after the First Amendment was in place. The First Amendment never intended to separate Christian principles from government. Yet today we so often hear the First Amendment coupled with the phrase separation of church and state. The First Amendment simply states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Obviously, the words separation, church, or state are not found in the First Amendment. Furthermore, that phrase appears in no founding document. While most recognize the phrase separation of church and state, few know its source. But it is important to understand the origins of that phrase. What is the history of the First Amendment? The process of drafting the First Amendment made the intent of the founders abundantly clear, for before they approved the final wording, the First Amendment went through nearly a dozen different iterations and extensive discussions. Those discussions, recorded in the U.S. Congressional records from June the 7th, the number of Christian schools had burgeoned to 32,000 schools. Currently, 8.5 million students, approximately 12% of the student population, attends private religious schools. According to the board responsible for the SAT test, the scores of students from private schools are nearly 80 points higher than those from public schools, which places them at the same level of scores prior to 1962-63. For private religious schools, it's as if no change had ever occurred. But for public schools, their scores are still continuing to decline. Another indicator of the impact that religious principles and religious schools have had on American education is found in the academic cream of the crop, the nation's academic elite, the National Merit Semifinalists. These are the top 0.5% of the nation's students. Now, according to the Department of Education, 12.4% of the nation's students attend private religious schools. 87.6% attend public schools. Since 12% of the nation's students attend private religious schools should produce 12% of the nation's cream of the crop. and 88% of the nation's students in public schools should produce 88% of the nation's cream of the crop. Yet that is not what is occurring. For example, in recent testing, that little group of 12.4% of the nation's students from private religious schools was producing 39.2% of the nation's top academic scholars. That's a level 3 times larger than its size. That's a phenomenal differential. We showed these statistics to a U.S. congressman. He looked at them and stated, "That makes perfect sense to me," he said. He said, "When you're talking about private schools, you're talking about money. You're talking affluency." He said private schools ought to get better scores than public schools. We investigated to see if that would be true and found that according to the Department of Education, the average private school costs $2,200 per student, while the average public school costs $5,400 per student. Private schools, with 2/5 the funds, are proportionally turning out a percentage of academic scholars 3 times higher than public schools. But consider, what is the fundamental difference between public and private schools? It is not in the core curriculum. The curriculum is the same. The Civil War takes place the same year at both schools. Math is the same at both schools. A verb is not an adjective simply because someone transfers to a private religious school. The basic difference is that one school utilizes religious principles and one does not, which appears to make an 80-point difference on the SAT test. The final category, the 4th category, was our country. What happened in the nation when we separated religious principles from public arenas? Well, what do you think happens when you start telling students, you can't see the 10 Commandments, you might obey them? Things like don't steal and don't kill. That has to have an effect on behavior. It did. Washington, in yet another warning from his farewell address, accurately predicted what has occurred. He said, "Let it simply be asked, where is the security for life, for reputation, and for property if the sense of religious obligation desert?" The sense of religious obligations has deserted, and currently there now seems to be no security for life, for reputation, or for property. For example, consider violent crime. After having remained statistically stable for years, since the removal of religious principles in 1962, the number of violent crimes has now surpassed population growth by 794%, causing the United States to become the world's leader in violent crime. Perhaps the best explanation for this increase was given by Thomas Jefferson, who succinctly states why Christianity was the best friend to government. Jefferson explained, "The precepts of philosophy laid hold of actions only, but Jesus pushed his scrutinies into the heart of man. He erected his tribunal in the region of his thoughts, and he purified the waters at the fountainhead." Where the law says, "Don't kill," in Matthew 5, Jesus says, "Don't get angry, don't hate." Clearly, if you prevent the anger and the hate, you've prevented the murder. Where the law says, "Don't commit adultery," Jesus says, "Don't lust in your heart." If you control the lust, you've controlled the adultery. The founders pointed out that only religion could stop crime before it started because all crime comes out of the heart, and if you can't control the heart, you can't control crime. That is why Christian principles were so valuable to government. Most of the founders expressed the same understanding. President John Adams pointed out that there was no government in the world able to make someone do what was right or able to control those who did not wish to be controlled. Adams explained, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion." Then notice what he said. "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." The founders believed that the Constitution would work only for people who had internal restraints and internal controls, for people who would use the Word of God as their standard. We've moved away from that, and clearly the Constitution, apart from religious principles, is not working the way it should, a fact evident on all the charts and statistics. Since 1962-63, the United States has undergone marked and dramatic statistical reversals, becoming the world's leader in the most unenviable categories. The United States is now #1 in the world in violent crime, #1 in the world in divorce, #1 in the Western world in teenage pregnancies, #1 in the world in voluntary abortions, #1 in the world in illegal drug use, and #1 in the world in illiteracy. Of all industrial nations, we have the highest illiteracy rate. A White House briefing recently reported that just 3 years ago, 700,000 students graduated from high school who, after 12 years of school, were unable to read their own diplomas. Looking at the list of categories that we now lead, Jeremiah 6:16 has some good advice. It instructs us that if we want the ways of peace, go back to the old paths.